She forced the 75-year-old cleaner to drink toilet water on Christmas night. Dark water splashed violently as Margaret, dressed in designer white, blonde hair perfectly styled, gold bracelets catching bathroom light, shoved the elderly black woman's face toward the open bowl, screaming about filth and incompetence. "Drink it. Drink it, you disgusting old hag. You love dirt so much. Taste it." Madame Rose's arthritic hands clutched white porcelain while her employer gripped her gray locks, forcing her down in that spotless bathroom where marble fixtures reflected wealth like mirrors of arrogance. Christmas carols drifted from the living room, Bing Crosby's White Christmas playing through hidden speakers. No one knew the woman being humiliated had secrets that would destroy everything Margaret thought she controlled. A door handle turned in the hallway. Footsteps approached. Something was about to shatter that couldn't be undone. Before we continue, hit that like and subscribe button. Your support helps us share these powerful stories with the world. Drop a comment right now and tell me, if you discovered your wife had humiliated someone you cared about, would you forgive her or let the law decide? And tell me where you're watching from. United States, UK, Canada, Atlanta, New York, Los Angeles, London. Now let's begin. You know those Beverly Hills mansions where everything gleamed with tech money, but something hollow hid beneath the luxury? That was the neighborhood where Madame Rose arrived 3 weeks before Christmas 2024. She came through an elite domestic agency, her application carefully vague, her references impeccable, but untraceable. 75 years old, silver locks pulled back in a neat bun, hands that trembled from arthritis and something deeper. The kind of woman wealthy people hired and never really saw. The agency's Tesla dropped her at the mansion gates on Mulholland Drive, white marble gleaming floor-to-ceiling windows catching Pacific sunlight, Christmas decorations already going up in early December. The kind of house featured in Architectural Digest with captions about innovation and elevation. The kind of place where tech billionaires posted photos with their beautiful wives and talked about gratitude and manifestation. She sat in the passenger seat, worn leather handbag clutched in her lap, watching the security guard approach with his tablet. Through the tinted windows, she could see the house, modernist architecture, infinity pool reflecting California sky. The kind of home that made people forget where they came from, if they'd ever come from anywhere that mattered. The guard checked his screen, then waved them through with barely a glance at her face. Old black women in domestic uniforms were invisible here, expected, part of the landscape like the imported palm trees and the Tesla charging stations. Inside, everything looked curated. Travertine floors, contemporary art that cost more than most people's houses, furniture arranged like a showroom for people who'd never known what it meant to sit on a second-hand couch. The kind of place where people measured worth by what they owned and forgot to measure what they'd lost to own it. The Tesla stopped at the front entrance. The agency representative, a young Latina woman with perfect nails, handed her a folder. Contract, rules, emergency contacts, NDA. The non-disclosure agreement was new, something about protecting the family's privacy and business interests. Madame Rose signed it without comment because she'd signed worse documents in her life, documents that had cost her everything but had kept someone she loved alive. She thanked the representative and stood at the door, bag in hand, looking up at the mansion where she'd come to watch from a distance, to verify what she'd spent 30 years protecting from afar. The door opened. A man in casual designer clothes, Alex Chen, stood there, his face polite but distracted. AirPods still in his ears, probably on a conference call even while greeting new staff. Behind him, deeper in the house, stood Margaret. White linen dress, gold jewelry, arms crossed. Blue eyes assessing with the precision of someone who'd built a career on visual presentation before marrying into money. Margaret's smile was controlled. Too controlled. The kind of smile Madame Rose had seen on white women's faces for 7 decades. The smile that said, "I'm being gracious by allowing you into my space. Don't forget it." Alex pulled out one AirPod. "Welcome, Mrs. Just Rose is fine, sir." "Rose. Great. Margaret will show you around. I've got a meeting in 5. Welcome to the team." He replaced the AirPod and disappeared into what looked like a home office with glass walls and multiple monitors displaying stock tickers and video conferences. Margaret's smile tightened. She didn't like being left to handle staff orientation. Madame Rose could see that immediately. It was beneath her, tedious. A reminder that despite the ring on her finger and the mansion she lived in, she was still the person who dealt with the help while her husband built empires. "Follow me," Margaret said, her voice carrying that particular tone white women used when they wanted to sound friendly but establish hierarchy in the same breath. Not quite rude, but nowhere near warm. The voice of someone who'd learned to perform kindness without actually feeling it. Madame Rose adjusted her bag and walked forward, carrying decades of silence like a heavy burden, unaware that the woman watching her had already decided she was beneath notice, already planning how to establish dominance, already sharpening the cruelty that would eventually destroy everything. The door closed behind her with a soft, expensive click. There was no turning back now. The agency had called it a premium placement when they briefed her in their Century City office 3 days earlier. Madame Rose sat across from a young white woman with acrylic nails who barely looked up from her MacBook as she explained the position. Tech billionaire, $28 million home, live-in arrangement, the woman said, scrolling through whatever profile she had on screen. The pay is exceptional. We're talking double the standard rate for Beverly Hills placements. But she paused, and that pause carried warning wrapped in HR speak. The current Mrs. Chen has very specific standards. Previous staff haven't lasted long, not because of the work itself, but because... Another pause. Some households require a particular temperament. Discretion, patience, the ability to maintain professional boundaries even when tested. Madame Rose understood perfectly. She'd spent a lifetime understanding things people didn't say directly, translating white people's euphemisms into the brutal truths they masked. Tested meant abused. Specific standards meant impossible standards designed to justify cruelty. Professional boundaries meant knowing your place and never, ever challenging the person with power over your livelihood. Her application had been strategic. She'd used her full name, Rose Patterson, without mentioning that 30 years ago. She'd been Rose Chen, married to Thomas Chen, mother to a son who'd been taken from her through violence and legal manipulation that had nearly killed her. References from people who owed her favors, who would vouch for her competence without asking questions about the decades-long gap in her employment history. The agency accepted everything without scrutiny because good domestic workers were hard to find, and elderly Black women came with an assumption of docility that made them valuable to wealthy white families who wanted help that wouldn't threaten their sense of superiority. When Alex opened the door that first day, Madame Rose kept her eyes appropriately lowered. She caught his face in peripheral vision. Handsome, mixed Asian and Black features. Tired around the eyes, successful in that particular way tech entrepreneurs were, wearing their exhaustion like a badge of honor. But she didn't let herself stare. She couldn't afford recognition. Not yet. Not until she understood what kind of man her son had become and what kind of woman he'd married. Margaret appeared in the foyer like she'd been waiting just out of sight, timing her entrance for maximum impact. The white linen dress hugged her figure with deliberate precision, showing off the Pilates-toned body she maintained with the dedication other people applied to careers. Her heels clicked against travertine as she approached, circling Madame Rose the way someone might inspect a purchase they weren't entirely satisfied with. "Welcome," Margaret said, though her voice carried no warmth. "Alex tells me you come highly recommended. I hope that's true." She let the statement hang in the air like an accusation searching for guilt. "We've had problems with staff before. Theft, laziness, boundary violations." Her blue eyes locked onto Madame Rose's face with uncomfortable intensity. "I won't tolerate any of that here. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Madame Rose said softly, her voice exactly the texture of obedience wealthy white people expected from elderly Black women. She kept her gaze on the polished floor where she could see Margaret's designer shoes reflected like a warning. Margaret outlined the rules with the efficiency of someone who'd memorized them through repetition, who'd probably delivered the same speech to multiple staff members who'd fled before completing their contracts. The cleaning schedule was posted in the staff quarters: breakfast by 7, lunch by 1, dinner by 7 unless otherwise instructed. The master bedroom was to be cleaned only when Margaret specifically requested it, never when Alex was home, never without express permission. Staff were not to eat from the main kitchen. There was a small kitchenette in the service area. Personal phone calls were to be kept brief and conducted in private quarters. No guests, ever. No unauthorized use of any amenities. And most importantly, staff were not to bother Alex with complaints or requests. Everything went through Margaret first. "Alex is building something revolutionary," Margaret said, and her voice took on a rehearsed quality, like she was reciting talking points from a TED Talk. "His company is changing the future of sustainable technology. He doesn't have time to be bothered with household management. That's my domain. I protect his energy and his time, which means you answer to me. Only me. Are we clear?" "Yes, ma'am." Madame Rose nodded at each instruction, her worn leather bag still clutched against her chest like a shield. She noticed Alex shift uncomfortably in the doorway of his office, still half listening to his conference call, but obviously hearing his wife's tone. His face registered something. Discomfort? Maybe embarrassment. But he didn't interrupt. He'd learned not to, Madame Rose could tell. Learned that intervening in Margaret's domain caused more problems than it solved. Margaret showed her to the staff quarters, a small suite behind the kitchen with a narrow bed, a standing air conditioning unit, and a window that looked onto the side wall of the neighboring mansion. It was clean but sparse, decorated with the bare minimum to avoid looking like servants' quarters in some period drama, but making absolutely clear where someone like Madame Rose belonged in the household hierarchy. "Everything you need is here," Margaret said, pointing to cleaning supplies organized with obsessive precision in the attached bathroom. "I expect the house to be spotless, always. If I find dust, streaks, anything out of place, we'll have problems. The kind of problems that end contracts." She paused at the door. "Oh, and Rose? Don't get comfortable. You're on a probationary period. Prove you can meet my standards, or you'll be gone by New Year's." After Margaret left, Madame Rose sat on the edge of the bed and let herself breathe. Her hands shook slightly as she opened her bag and checked the contents with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd moved frequently, who'd lived with the constant possibility of needing to flee. A few changes of clothes, toiletries, medications for her arthritis, the brown envelope wrapped in plastic, documents she couldn't risk losing, evidence she'd protected for 3 decades. And beneath everything, wrapped carefully in soft cloth, the silver locket with the faded photograph she'd carried since the day they'd forced her to leave. She opened the locket and looked at the image until her vision blurred. A young boy, maybe 8 years old, mixed race with his father's Asian features and her own brown skin, smiling at the camera with gap-toothed joy. Her son, Alex. Before the family had taken him, before they'd beaten her nearly to death and told her she'd never see him again if she didn't disappear. 30 years. 3 decades of hiding, surviving, watching from a distance when she could, never daring to reveal herself because the threats had been explicit, and she'd believed them capable of following through. Thomas Chen's family had money, power, connections in both the Chinese-American business community and the broader tech world that would eventually make billionaires of those who got in early. She'd been the poor black woman who'd somehow seduced their golden son, who'd produced a mixed-race child they'd initially rejected, who'd become inconvenient after Thomas died suddenly of an aneurysm, leaving behind stock options and property, and a son they suddenly wanted to control. The beating had happened in her small apartment in Oakland, 3 of Thomas's cousins and his older brother Richard. They'd made their position clear: sign over custody, sign over any claim to Thomas's estate, disappear, or die. And they'd made sure Alex would have an accident too if she ever tried to come back. So she'd signed. She'd disappeared. She'd changed her name, moved constantly, taken cash jobs that kept her off any official records. She'd survived, but she'd also been smart. Thomas had told her about accounts his family didn't know about, small investments he'd made independently, passwords and access codes he'd shared in quiet moments. After the beating, after she'd healed enough to function, she'd carefully, methodically, liquidated those accounts. Not much, maybe $200,000 total, but enough. She'd invested carefully over the years, lived frugally, and watched that money grow. She'd used it to survive, to help others when she could, and eventually, to hire private investigators who'd tracked Alex's life from a distance. She'd learned he'd been raised by Richard, told his mother had abandoned him, had been too unstable to care for him. She'd learned he'd gone to Stanford, had started a company in sustainable battery technology that had exploded into $1 billion valuation. She'd learned he'd married a white influencer named Margaret Whitmore 2 years ago in a wedding that made the society pages. And 6 months ago, she'd learned something that had finally brought her out of hiding. Richard Chen had died of a heart attack. The man who'd orchestrated her beating, who'd threatened her son's life, who'd stolen 30 years from both of them, was gone. The threat was over. She could finally reveal herself. But first, she needed to know if it was safe, if Alex would believe her, if his life was stable enough to withstand the truth. So she'd applied to work in his home, to observe, to verify, to decide. She hadn't anticipated Margaret. Madame Rose learned the rhythm of the house quickly, because survival had always required quick learning. Margaret woke late, usually around 9, and expected a specific breakfast: avocado toast on gluten-free bread, green smoothie with exact proportions of kale and spirulina, hot lemon water. The order had to be delivered to her bedroom within 15 minutes of her waking, which meant Madame Rose learned to listen for sounds from the master suite and prepare everything in advance, keeping it fresh until Margaret's alarm went off. Alex left early for his office in Palo Alto, usually before Madame Rose finished her morning bathroom cleaning. He was kind when he saw her, always saying good morning, asking if she needed anything, but distant in the way successful people were with staff, present but not really seeing, aware of her function, but not her humanity. The house ran on Margaret's moods, which shifted like California weather. Sunny when she felt powerful, when Instagram engagement was high, when Alex was attentive. Storming when she felt threatened by anything or anyone, a dropped follower count, a business dinner she wasn't invited to, staff who didn't perform invisible labor perfectly enough to maintain her illusion of effortless living. Madame Rose moved through the gleaming rooms like a ghost, exactly as she'd planned. She cleaned the already clean surfaces until they shined brighter. She scrubbed bathrooms twice because once was never enough to avoid Margaret's inspection. Her arthritic hands ached in cold water, especially during kitchen work when she had to reach into the deep sink to scrub pots and pans Margaret claimed weren't clean enough the first time. "Don't look at me when I'm talking to you," Margaret said one morning when Madame Rose had made the mistake of meeting her eyes during an instruction about proper towel folding. "It's disrespectful. I need you to understand your place here. Eyes down when I speak." "Yes, ma'am. Sorry, ma'am." Madame Rose lowered her gaze immediately, but she watched Margaret from beneath lowered lashes, studying the woman her son had married. Beautiful. Yes, in that particular way, white women with money and access to the best cosmetic procedures were beautiful, symmetrical, polished, curated. But beauty stretched thin over something corroded, something insecure and desperate that needed constant validation through domination. Margaret's complaints were never really about the work itself, but about power, the need to remind everyone constantly that she controlled the space and everyone in it. That her marriage to Alex had elevated her from influencer to billionaire's wife, and she would defend that elevation with whatever weapons she had, including cruelty to those beneath her in the hierarchy she'd constructed. The other staff warned her in whispers. Miguel, the gardener, mentioned during a brief conversation that the previous cleaner, a Filipino woman named Teresa, had been fired for talking back after Margaret accused her of stealing jewelry that later turned up in Margaret's own dresser. No apology had been offered. Teresa had been escorted out by security within an hour. The driver, James, a black man in his 40s, avoided the house entirely except when absolutely necessary. "Just do your work and stay invisible," he advised Madame Rose one morning when Margaret was at her Pilates class. "That's what she wants. People who function like appliances, there when she needs them, invisible when she doesn't." Madame Rose overcleaned everything because overcleaning meant fewer opportunities for criticism, fewer chances to draw the dangerous kind of attention. Her back bent lower with each passing day, not just from age, but from the weight of staying invisible while living in such close proximity to the truth she'd hidden for so long. At night, alone in her small room, she would take out the locket and look at the photograph until her eyes burned. The boy in the picture smiled up at her across decades of silence and separation. She'd come here to know if he was safe, if he was happy, if he'd grown into someone good despite everything. But she was beginning to understand that happiness in this house was conditional, and safety was an illusion maintained by wealth and security systems, and the ability to destroy anyone who threatened the carefully constructed narrative Margaret had built around her marriage. 3 weeks passed this way. Madame Rose cleaning, watching, waiting. Alex working 16-hour days, barely present. Margaret performing the role of billionaire's wife on social media while treating staff like props in her manufactured life. Christmas decorations going up in a house where no real joy seemed to live. Madame Rose told herself she just needed to stay quiet a little longer. Just watch. Just wait for the right moment to reveal herself, if that moment ever came. Maybe after the holidays. Maybe in the new year when the house was quieter, when she'd proven herself indispensable, when revealing the truth wouldn't seem like manipulation but like a gift. She didn't know that Margaret's cruelty was escalating, searching for an outlet, and that Christmas night was approaching like a storm no one could see coming. She didn't know that the security cameras Alex had installed throughout the house, including in the bathrooms, against Margaret's wishes, for liability protection, would capture everything. And she didn't know that the locket she carried everywhere, the one piece of evidence that could prove everything, would fall from her pocket at exactly the moment when truth needed to reveal itself most. Margaret woke each morning in a custom-made bed that cost $40,000, but luxury never quite settled into her bones. She would lie still for a moment after her alarm, feeling the Egyptian cotton sheets against her skin, the climate-controlled air, listening to Alex's steady breathing beside her or, more often lately, finding his side of the bed already empty, him already gone to the office before dawn. She'd married into this wealth 2 years ago after a whirlwind romance that still felt like something that had happened to someone else. She'd been 28, an Instagram influencer with 300,000 followers, making decent money from sponsored posts, but always one algorithm change away from irrelevance. Alex had been 32, already wealthy from his first company exit, building his second venture with the single-minded focus that made tech billionaires. They'd met at a charity gala in San Francisco. She'd been there as someone's plus one. He'd been there because appearing at charity events was what successful entrepreneurs did. He'd been kind, generous, almost awkwardly earnest in his interest. The proposal came with a ring that made her followers lose their minds and a promise of a life she'd only seen in magazines. She'd said yes because saying no to this kind of elevation seemed insane. And because at 28, she was tired of performing relatability for an audience that could turn on her any moment, tired of watching other women live the life she deserved. But no one had warned her that living in a mansion could feel like trespassing in a museum. That Alex's kindness came with the distraction of someone building something bigger than any relationship. That the Asian American business community her husband came from would always see her as an outsider, the white influencer who'd somehow captured their rising star. That she'd spend her days managing a household she hadn't earned and couldn't quite claim as her own. She rose from bed and moved through her morning routine with the precision of someone performing for an invisible audience. $200 skincare applied in the exact order the facialist had specified. Makeup that looked natural but took 40 minutes to apply. Hair blown out with the perfect amount of wave. She chose white White jeans, white cashmere sweater. White always because it photographed well and suggested purity, cleanliness, elevation above the mess of ordinary life. She came downstairs to find Alex already in the kitchen, coffee in hand, reading something on his tablet. 3 different news sources, probably, scanning for mentions of his company, for moves his competitors were making, for opportunities he might miss if he stopped paying attention for even a moment. "You look beautiful," he said, like he said every morning, and she accepted the compliment with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes because she'd heard the distraction in his voice. The way the compliment was automatic rather than genuine. She poured herself lemon water and stood by the window overlooking the infinity pool, watching Miguel trim hedges with mechanical precision. The gardener never looked toward the house if he could help it. Smart man. He'd learned quickly after she'd corrected him about leaving tools visible from the living room. "This is a home, not a work site," she'd told him sharply. "Have some sense." Alex left for the office with a kiss on her cheek that felt more like routine than passion. She watched his Tesla pull out of the driveway. He'd bought the Cybertruck despite her insistence it was ugly because he said it aligned with his company's values, and felt the familiar emptiness settle back into place. The house was hers now for the next 12 hours, and she needed to fill it with something that proved she mattered, that she wasn't just decoration in someone else's success story. That's when she noticed the kitchen counter and felt the first flicker of irritation. It was spotless, obviously. Rose had already cleaned it, but Margaret ran her finger along the granite anyway, searching for dust that wasn't there. Searching for a reason to call the old woman out and remind her who was in charge. She found Rose in the guest bathroom, down on arthritic knees scrubbing tiles that already gleamed. The old woman looked up when Margaret entered, then quickly lowered her eyes in that deferential way that should have felt like respect, but instead felt like judgment. "This bathroom smells like chemicals," Margaret said, though it smelled perfectly fine. "You're using too much bleach. Do you want to poison us? Use half the amount next time." "Yes, ma'am. Sorry, ma'am." The old woman's voice was so soft, so practiced in submission, and something about that softness made Margaret's jaw tighten. Something about the way Rose never argued, never defended herself, never showed fear, just quiet acceptance. Felt like mockery. Like the old woman could see through her. Could see the girl from a middle-class family in Orange County who'd bought designer knockoffs and carefully curated a life of aspirational content before landing Alex. "And when you're finished here, re-clean the master bathroom. I saw streaks on the mirror this morning." There had been no streaks. Margaret knew this. But Rose only nodded. "Yes, ma'am." And that quiet acceptance felt like acid on Margaret's skin. Over the following days, Margaret found herself inventing problems where none existed. The living room wasn't dusted properly, though not a speck was visible. The hardwood floors had streaks, though they shined like glass. The laundry wasn't folded correctly, though every edge was crisp and precise. Each criticism was delivered in a voice Margaret modulated carefully, not quite shouting, but sharp enough to cut. Loud enough to establish dominance, calibrated to sound justified to anyone who might overhear. Alex worked from home occasionally, and she needed to maintain the appearance of reasonable standards rather than arbitrary cruelty. Rose absorbed every criticism with the same response. "Sorry, ma'am." And that sorry began to feel like judgment, like the old woman was humoring her, like Rose knew Margaret didn't really belong in this house any more than she did. Margaret started timing the old woman's tasks, appearing suddenly in doorways to catch her resting, though she never did. Started leaving deliberate tests, a dropped napkin, a vase moved 2 inches from its usual position to see if Rose would notice and correct them without being told. The old woman always did, silently, efficiently, and somehow that made it worse. Margaret's friends would visit for afternoon wine, other wives and influencers, designer bags, expensive athleisure, faces full of fillers and Botox, and they would compliment her home with the kind of envy Margaret had craved all her life. "Your house is gorgeous, Mags. You're living the dream." "Alex is so amazing. You're so lucky." "God is good. You manifested this." And Margaret would smile and pour more wine and feel like a fraud in her own living room because she hadn't built any of this, hadn't earned it through anything except being attractive enough and available at the right moment. After they left, she would find reasons to summon Rose. The wine glasses weren't properly cleaned, the cushions weren't arranged correctly. There were crumbs on the floor that needed immediate attention. She needed the old woman to understand that this was her house, her space, her domain, and that everyone in it existed at her pleasure. One evening, Alex came home early, rare, almost unheard of, and found Margaret in the kitchen berating Rose over a pot that wasn't scrubbed to Margaret's satisfaction. His face registered something between confusion and discomfort. "Honey, it looks fine to me," he said carefully, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone trying to de-escalate without taking sides. Margaret turned to him with practiced sweetness, the smile that had captured him 2 years ago. "You're tired from work, babe. You don't notice these things. I'm just maintaining our standards." She said like she'd paid for a single tile in this house. After Alex retreated to his office, Margaret moved closer to Rose. Close enough to smell the cheap soap the old woman used, close enough to see the arthritis swelling in her knuckles, close enough to feel powerful through proximity to someone powerless. "You're lucky to work here," she said quietly. "Don't forget that. Some people would kill for this opportunity. You're making more than most cleaners in Los Angeles. Show some gratitude." "Yes, ma'am," Rose whispered, and Margaret saw something flicker behind those downcast eyes, something that looked almost like pity, and rage bloomed hot in her chest. She didn't understand why this old woman's presence felt like an accusation. Didn't understand why making her scrub the same bathroom 3 times didn't provide the satisfaction it should. Didn't understand why, in a house full of everything she'd ever wanted, she felt more like an imposter every day. What Margaret didn't know was that imposters recognize each other instinctively, even when one is pretending to be powerful and the other is pretending to be invisible. And that recognition, unspoken and dangerous, was building towards something that would detonate on Christmas night, when Margaret's need to prove she belonged would collide with Madame Rose's secret truth in a bathroom where spotless marble tiles would witness the destruction of everything Margaret thought she'd built. The decorator arrived on December 20th with a truck full of Christmas magic that cost more than Madame Rose's yearly salary. Margaret supervised every placement with the intensity of someone for whom perfection wasn't just aesthetic but existential, proof that she belonged in this world of wealth and taste. The tree needed to be exactly 12 feet tall, positioned in the living room where it would be visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, so neighbors driving by would see their taste, their wealth, their superiority. Lights had to be warm white, not cool. Cool was tacky, common, something middle-class people used. The ornaments were custom-made, blown glass from a boutique in Venice Beach, each one costing more than most families spent on Christmas dinner. Fresh garland draped along the floating staircase, requiring daily spritzing with pine scent spray so the house would smell like luxury the moment anyone entered. A nativity scene in the entryway. Ironic, given that Margaret never went to church, but it photographed well and suggested values, tradition, the kind of aspirational Christianity that wealthy white people practiced through aesthetics rather than actual faith. Alex wrote the check without blinking and retreated to his office, already on another call with investors, already somewhere else mentally. The company was in the middle of a crucial funding round. Christmas was just another deadline to manage around. Margaret created a schedule on her iPad, color-coded and detailed down to 15-minute increments. Guests would arrive on Christmas night at 7. Cocktails in the living room. Dinner at 8. Dessert by the pool if weather permitted. She'd invited people who mattered. Tech executives and their wives, influencers with millions of followers, a couple from Alex's Stanford days who'd also become billionaires. People whose approval she'd been courting for 2 years. People who could validate that she belonged in their world. This evening would prove she wasn't just some influencer who'd married well, but someone who understood elegance, sophistication, the performance of wealth at the highest level. The catering company confirmed the menu 3 times. Organic turkey from a farm in Napa that charged by the ounce. Truffle everything. Truffle mashed potatoes. Truffle Brussels sprouts. Truffle mac and cheese. Wagyu beef appetizers. Champagne that cost $500 per bottle. Everything photographable. Everything designed to generate the kind of Instagram content that made people stop scrolling and feel inadequate by comparison. But perfection required perfect conditions, and perfect conditions required perfect staff. Margaret's stress manifested as hypervigilance that bordered on mania. She followed Rose from room to room, pointing out dust particles that might have been imaginary, water spots on faucets that gleamed like mirrors, throw pillows arranged 1 degree off from perfect symmetry. The old woman accepted every criticism with her signature response. "Sorry, ma'am," and re-cleaned everything without protest. But her silence only amplified Margaret's anxiety. It felt like judgment, like Rose could see through the performance to the terrified girl beneath who didn't belong in this mansion, who would be exposed as a fraud the moment someone looked too closely. On Christmas Eve, Margaret woke at 5 in the morning and couldn't fall back asleep. She walked through the house in her silk robe, turning on lights, inspecting surfaces, looking for flaws that would humiliate her in front of guests she desperately needed to impress. In the downstairs powder room, the one guests would use, she noticed the toilet bowl had faint shadows from cleaning chemicals, mixing with early morning light, filtering through the frosted window. She summoned Rose at 6, before the old woman had finished her morning prayer. Rose appeared in her nightgown and robe, eyes still heavy with sleep, arthritis making her movements stiff in the cold morning air. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret pointed at the toilet. "This is how you clean? With shadows and stains visible? Guests will use this bathroom tonight. Important people. What will they think of me if they see this filth?" The toilet was spotless. Rose had scrubbed it the evening before using the exact products Margaret had specified. But she didn't argue. She simply nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Sorry, ma'am," and lowered herself painfully to her knees to clean it again. Margaret stood in the doorway watching, arms crossed, feeling her heart race with an anxiety she couldn't name. The old woman's compliance should have been satisfying, but instead it felt like mockery, like Rose could see through her panic to the terrified girl beneath who didn't belong in this mansion, who would be exposed as a fraud the moment someone looked too closely. Throughout Christmas Eve, Margaret's demands escalated. The kitchen floor needed mopping 3 times. The champagne glasses required hand polishing even though they came from the dishwasher spotless. The guest towels needed refolding because the edges weren't precisely aligned. Rose moved through each task with mechanical patience, her face neutral, her responses automatic. And that neutrality felt like judgment. Alex noticed during dinner, just the two of them eating catered food at their enormous dining table, the house perfect around them, tension crackling in the air like static electricity. "You seem stressed, babe. Everything's going to be perfect tomorrow. You've worked so hard." He reached across to squeeze her hand, and Margaret felt tears threaten behind her eyes for reasons she couldn't articulate. "I just want everything to be right," she said, and heard the desperation in her own voice that she'd been trying to hide. "It will be," he assured her, then went back to his meal, already checking his phone, already somewhere else. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay beside Alex's peacefully breathing form and imagined disasters. Guests arriving to a house that revealed her inadequacy, women whispering about crooked decorations, dirty bathrooms, poor taste. The fantasy of belonging she'd constructed for 2 years shattering over appetizers and champagne. At 2 in the morning, she went downstairs in her robe and inspected every room by lamplight. She found nothing wrong because nothing was wrong, but the anxiety clung to her skin like humidity, suffocating and inescapable. Christmas morning arrived with bright California sunshine and mild 60-degree weather. Perfect conditions that should have calmed her but didn't. The caterers would arrive at 4, guests at 7. She had 5 hours to ensure nothing would expose her as unworthy of this life. She showered, applied full makeup even though she'd reapply later, and chose white silk pants, white cashmere sweater, white always, because it suggested purity, cleanliness, elevation above the mess of ordinary life. Continue 1506. She found Rose in the kitchen preparing breakfast. Alex's usual egg white omelet, Margaret's usual Greek yogurt with berries and granola, and felt irritation spark for no reason except the old woman's presence reminded her of everything she feared about herself. After breakfast is cleaned, recheck all the bathrooms, Margaret commanded. Every single one. I want them perfect, not good. Perfect. Yes, ma'am. Rose's voice was so soft it was almost not there. Margaret watched her for a moment. This elderly black woman with bent back and trembling hands who never complained, never argued, never fought back, and felt something dark unfurl in her chest. A need to push harder, to find the breaking point, to make someone else feel as small and inadequate as she felt in her borrowed palace. By noon, the bathrooms had been cleaned again. The house gleamed like a showroom. Decorations sparkled in sunlight streaming through massive windows. Everything was ready. But Margaret went to inspect the downstairs powder room one more time, the one where this had all started days ago, the one guests would use tonight. And she saw, or imagined she saw, dark water stains in the toilet bowl that looked like accusation, like failure, like proof that she didn't belong here and everyone would soon know it. She called for Rose with a voice that carried more than anger. It carried panic dressed as rage, inadequacy dressed as authority, and the desperate need to prove power over someone weaker because she had no real power of her own. Rose came to the bathroom door, her uniform pressed and neat, her face carefully neutral. Unaware that Margaret's breaking point had arrived and was searching for something to break. The stage was set. The mansion sparkled. Christmas carols played softly through hidden speakers. And in that spotless bathroom where marble fixtures reflected wealth like mirrors of pride, violence was about to shatter the illusion of holiday peace in ways neither woman could take back. Margaret stood at the bathroom threshold staring at the toilet bowl like it had personally betrayed her. The water wasn't dirty. It was slightly darkened from cleaning chemicals and the angle of afternoon light filtering through the frosted window. But in Margaret's mind, warped by hours of mounting panic, it became proof of sabotage, of incompetence, of deliberate humiliation planned for the moment her guests would arrive and judge her unworthy. Rose appeared within seconds of being called, moving as quickly as her 75-year-old body allowed, her arthritic knees protesting each step. She stood in the doorway with her hands folded in front of her uniform, her face arranged in the careful neutrality that had kept her safe for 3 weeks. Yes, ma'am. Margaret didn't turn around. Her voice came out low and shaking, barely controlled. This bathroom, this toilet, I've asked you how many times to keep it clean? Rose's eyes moved to the toilet bowl. She'd scrubbed it twice already today, once at dawn and again 2 hours ago. The porcelain gleamed white. The water was clear except for the faint tint from blue cleaning solution still dissolving. I cleaned it this morning, ma'am, and again at— I don't want excuses. Margaret cut her off. Spinning around so fast her white sweater swirled like anger given form. I want it clean. Do you understand the word clean, or is that too complicated for someone like you? The insult hung in the air between them. Rose felt it land, but didn't flinch. She'd survived worse than words. Yes, ma'am, I will clean it again now. She moved toward the cleaning supplies stored under the sink, but Margaret blocked her path. The younger woman's face had transformed into something Rose recognized from decades of observing the powerful, the look of someone who needed to hurt someone else to feel in control, who had found their victim, and wouldn't stop until blood was drawn, metaphorically or otherwise. You've dirtied what you were paid to clean, Margaret hissed, and her hand shot out faster than someone her size should move. Fingers tangling in Rose's silver locks, yanking hard enough to make the old woman's scalp burn. Rose gasped at the sudden pain. Ma'am, please. You make my house look like trash and you say please? Margaret's laugh was brittle and high. She yanked harder, forcing Rose's head downward. The old woman's knees buckled, arthritis and shock combining, and she fell forward, her hands instinctively reaching for something to break her fall. Her palms landed on the toilet seat. Margaret's rage found its full voice then, amplified by panic and inadequacy and 2 years of feeling like an imposter in her own marriage. If you love filth so much, taste it. Her other hand joined the first in Rose's hair, both fists now gripping with manic strength, shoving the elderly woman's face toward the open toilet bowl. Rose's scream tore from her throat before she could stop it, a sound of pure terror that contained decades of suppressed fear, of survival instinct finally breaking through silence. Her arthritic hands clutched the porcelain rim, her arms shaking as she tried to resist the downward pressure. But Margaret was younger, stronger, driven by something beyond reason. "Drink it!" Margaret screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. "Drink what you deserve, you filthy old hag!" The dark water, tinted blue from chemicals, shadowed by the angle of Margaret's body blocking the light, splashed upward as Rose's face was forced closer. Droplets hit her cheeks. Her chin touched the water's surface. The chemical smell burned her nostrils. Her mouth opened in another scream, and water splashed against her lips. The taste of bleach and humiliation flooding her senses. Christmas carols drifted from the living room speakers. Bing Crosby's White Christmas sung with that smooth, nostalgic warmth, creating a grotesque contrast to the violence unfolding in the spotless bathroom. Rose's fingers slipped against wet porcelain as she tried to push herself up, but Margaret's grip in her hair was relentless, forcing her down, down, down into the bowl where dignity went to drown. The locket slipped from Rose's uniform pocket in the struggle, the small silver oval on its thin chain. But neither woman noticed it skitter across the marble floor, coming to rest near the bathroom door, catching light like a signal flare waiting to be seen. "Confess!" Margaret shrieked, spittle flying from her lips. Her face contorted into something ugly that no amount of expensive skincare could mask. "Confess you've been trying to sabotage me. Admit you want to embarrass me in front of my guests." Rose couldn't speak. Her mouth tasted like chemicals and shame. Water dripped from her chin. Her eyes burned from the splash, from tears, from the physical pain of having her head wrenched at an angle her aged spine couldn't accommodate. The scream that came from her this time wasn't words, just pure sound, the noise a wounded animal makes when it knows death is near. Margaret jerked her head up suddenly, only to slam it down again, and more water splashed violently, soaking Rose's face, her uniform collar, running down into her eyes. The old woman's hands clutched the toilet seat in white-knuckled desperation, her whole body trembling from exertion and terror, and the horrible realization that she might die here, in this bathroom, on Christmas Day, at the hands of a woman who didn't even know she was killing her husband's mother. "I should make you lick it clean," Margaret panted, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her perfectly applied makeup beginning to streak with sweat, and something darker. The realization of what she was doing trying to surface through the rage, but not quite breaking through. "You want to make me look bad? You want everyone to think I can't even manage a stupid old cleaner?" The words made no sense because none of this had ever been about cleaning. It was about Margaret's terror of being exposed as unworthy, about her desperate need to dominate someone weaker to convince herself she had power, about the hollow place inside her that no amount of wealth or violence could fill. Rose's vision blurred. The bathroom lights above her swam like stars drowning in dark water. Her chest heaved as she tried to breathe through her nose, tried to keep the chemical water out of her lungs, tried to survive this moment the way she'd survived every other moment when power had tried to destroy her. And that's when she heard it. The sound that would change everything. The bathroom door, which had been ajar, swung fully open. Footsteps stopped abruptly in the doorway. A sharp intake of breath. A man's voice thick with disbelief and horror. "What the hell, Margaret?" Time fractured. Margaret's hands loosened in Rose's hair. The old woman collapsed forward, her face hitting the toilet seat edge, a new pain blooming across her cheekbone. Dark water dripped from her hair, her face, her dignity dissolving in chemical-tinted droplets that fell to the pristine marble floor. Margaret spun around, her white outfit somehow still spotless despite the violence, her face already rearranging itself from manic rage to shocked innocence. Alex stood in the doorway, still dressed in his casual Christmas morning clothes, designer jeans, cashmere sweater, a wrapped gift in his hands that he must have retrieved from his office, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. The Christmas carol changed to "Joy to the World" as husband and wife stared at each other across the space of a bathroom that had just become a crime scene, while between them, an elderly woman coughed water and blood and tried to remember how to breathe, unaware that the locket that would expose everything had already fallen where truth always falls, right at the feet of the person who needs to see it most. Alex's brain struggled to process what his eyes were showing him. His wife, the woman he'd married 2 years ago, the woman who posted inspirational quotes about kindness and gratitude, the woman who'd seemed so perfect during their courtship, had her hands tangled in an elderly woman's hair, forcing the cleaner's face toward an open toilet while water dripped from the old woman's chin and Christmas music played like the soundtrack to a nightmare he couldn't wake from. The gift, something he'd bought for Margaret weeks ago, hidden in his office, slipped from his fingers and hit the marble floor with a soft thud that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Margaret's transformation was instantaneous and complete. Her grip on Rose's hair released like she'd been burned. She stumbled backward, one hand flying to her chest, her mouth forming an O of manufactured surprise. "Alex, thank God you're here." Her voice pitched high with false relief. "This woman, she tried to steal from us. And when I caught her, she attacked me. She fell into the toilet herself. I was trying to help her." Alex's hand came up slowly, palm out, the universal gesture for stop. His voice, when it emerged, was barely above a whisper, like speaking louder would make the scene in front of him more real than he could handle. "I saw you." Margaret's eyes widened. "What? No, you don't understand. I saw you." Each word came out separately, weighted with the death of illusions. His hand was shaking. "You had her head. You were forcing—" Rose coughed violently, chemical-laced water spattering the toilet rim. She remained collapsed against the porcelain, her arthritic hands clutching the seat like it was the only solid thing in a world that had just tried to drown her. Her whole body trembled from exertion, from shock, from the physical impossibility of processing that Alex was here. Her son was here, witnessing her humiliation, but not yet knowing who she really was. Margaret's tactical retreat accelerated into full offense. Her voice took on an edge of hysteria, carefully calculated to generate sympathy. "She's been sabotaging me for weeks, deliberately making mistakes, trying to embarrass me before the party tonight. I caught her putting dirty water in the toilet to make me look bad in front of our guests. And when I confronted her, she became aggressive." "Stop lying." Alex's voice was still quiet, but something in it made Margaret's mouth snap shut. He moved into the bathroom, his expensive sneakers stepping around the locket on the floor without seeing it, his eyes fixed on his wife like he was seeing her for the first time and hating what the light revealed. "I stood in that doorway for at least 15 seconds before you noticed me. I saw everything." Margaret's face cycled through emotions too quickly to name. She reached for anger because anger had always worked before. "You're going to believe this? This servant over your own wife? She's probably been planning this. Probably waiting for a moment to make me look bad so she could claim abuse and sue us." Alex's phone came out of his pocket. Margaret's words died in her throat as she watched him unlock the screen with shaking fingers. For a moment, no one moved. Rose's labored breathing and the distant Christmas carols were the only sounds. "What are you doing?" Margaret's voice had lost its confidence, replaced by something that sounded almost like fear. Alex didn't answer. His fingers moved across the screen with deliberate precision. He opened an app, the home security system he'd insisted on installing 8 months ago after a series of home invasions in neighboring Beverly Hills estates. Margaret had complained about the cameras, said they made the house feel like a prison, but he'd been adamant. Liability protection, he'd said. Insurance requirements for a property this valuable. The app interface loaded. Multiple camera feeds displayed in a grid. Living room, front entrance, driveway, kitchen. And there, in the upper right quadrant, bathroom. Wide-angle lens mounted discreetly near the ceiling vent, installed by technicians who'd worked while Margaret was at her SoulCycle class. Alex's thumb tapped the bathroom feed. The screen expanded to full size. He dragged the timeline back 90 seconds and pressed play. The phone speaker was small, but adequate. Margaret's voice emerged clearly, tinny but unmistakable. "You've dirtied what you were paid to clean." The video showed her blocking Rose's path, showed her hand shooting out to grab the old woman's locks, showed the violent downward shove, showed water splashing as Rose's face was forced toward the bowl, showed it all with the dispassionate clarity that only technology provides. "If you love filth so much, taste it." Margaret's recorded voice screamed from the phone speaker, while real-time Margaret stood frozen, watching her own cruelty played back in high definition. "Drink it!" The recorded Margaret shrieked. "Drink what you deserve, you filthy old hag!" Alex's hand shook so badly the video image wobbled, but he kept watching until it reached the present moment. Himself appearing in the doorway, Margaret's instant transformation, the lies beginning even as Rose coughed water at her feet. He stopped the playback and looked up at his wife. His face had gone pale except for 2 spots of color high on his cheekbones. When he spoke, his voice was eerily calm, the kind of calm that comes after shock has burned through all other emotions. "You called her a hag. You forced her face into the toilet. On Christmas Day. In our home." Margaret's mouth opened and closed. Her brain was visibly racing, trying to find the angle, the explanation, the way to turn this around. "I was stressed. The party. You don't understand the pressure I've been under." "She's been... There's a woman on our bathroom floor who tastes like bleach." Alex's calm cracked slightly, anger bleeding through. "And you want to talk about your stress?" "She's been making my life hell." Margaret's voice rose to something like a shriek. "You're never here. You don't see how she looks at me, how she judges everything I do." "She judges you?" Alex's laugh was short and bitter. He took a step toward Margaret and she actually flinched. "You just assaulted an elderly employee in our home and I have video evidence. Do you understand what that means?" Margaret's face cycled to desperation. "Baby, please, we can fix this. We can pay her off. Give her extra money. Make her sign something. She probably needs the money anyway." Alex's phone was already moving to his ear, his other hand coming up in that stop gesture again as Margaret started forward. "Don't. Just don't move. Don't speak. Don't..." His voice broke slightly and he turned away from her, from the bathroom, from the scene that was destroying whatever remained of his marriage in real time. The phone rang twice before someone answered. 911. What's your emergency?" "My name is Alex Chen. I'm at 2847 Mulholland Drive in Beverly Hills. I need police immediately. There's been an assault." His voice steadied as he gave instructions, became almost robotic. "Yes, in my home. No. The perpetrator is contained. Just please hurry." He ended the call and finally looked down at Rose, still collapsed against the toilet. The old woman's face was turned slightly away, water dripping from her chin, her whole body shaking. Alex's face did something complicated. Recognition trying to surface, memory tugging at consciousness. Something about the way she held herself, even in complete degradation, seemed familiar, in a way he couldn't quite place. He moved toward her slowly, pulling off his cashmere sweater as he approached. "I'm so sorry," he said quietly, and his voice carried a weight that suggested he was apologizing for more than just Margaret's attack. Apologizing for systems and privilege, and all the ways power protected some people while leaving others vulnerable to violence in spotless bathrooms on Christmas Day. He draped the sweater over Rose's shoulders and knelt beside her, careful not to touch her without permission, giving her space to breathe and recover and exist as a human being with dignity, even though someone had just tried to strip that dignity away. That's when he saw it. The small locket near his foot, the thin silver chain tangled around itself, something about it catching the light in a way that drew his eye. He picked it up automatically, meaning to return it, assuming it had fallen from Rose during the struggle. The locket was old, worn, the kind of inexpensive jewelry someone kept for sentimental reasons rather than monetary worth. A simple oval, tarnished silver that had gone dull with age and handling. But it had a clasp, and the clasp had come loose in the fall, and the locket had opened slightly, revealing the edge of a photograph inside. Alex's fingers moved without conscious thought, opening the locket fully, and the entire world stopped. The photograph was faded, the colors washed out from age and exposure, protected by scratched plastic that had gone cloudy over decades. It showed a young boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, mixed Asian and black, standing in what looked like a modest backyard somewhere in California. He wore shorts and an oversized Giants t-shirt, his smile gap-toothed and genuine, one hand raised in a wave at whoever held the camera. Beside him stood a woman in her early 40s, beautiful despite the faded quality of the image, her hand resting on the boy's shoulder with unmistakable maternal pride. Her face was younger, unlined by decades of hardship, but the eyes were the same eyes that had watched him for 3 weeks, from beneath downcast lashes, the same eyes that had absorbed his wife's cruelty without complaint. Alex's breath caught in his chest like something physical had lodged there. He knew that boy. He was that boy. The house in the background. He remembered it now. The small rental in Oakland where they'd lived before his father died, before everything had changed, before his mother had... His mother. They'd told him she'd abandoned them, that she'd been unstable, couldn't handle being a widow, had left him with his father's family, and disappeared. By the time he was a teenager, he'd stopped asking about her. By the time he was in college, he'd convinced himself she was probably dead. It was easier than believing she'd chosen to leave him. But the woman in this photograph wasn't someone who'd abandoned her child. He could see it in the way her hand rested on his shoulder, in the pride in her eyes, in the way she stood, protective, present, devoted. Alex's head snapped up, locket still clutched in his shaking hand, and looked at Rose properly for the first time since entering the bathroom. Not as an employee, not as a victim, but as a person whose face he was supposed to know. She was still collapsed against the toilet, water dripping from her silver locks, her aged face turned slightly away from him. But something in the curve of her jaw, the set of her shoulders despite their bent posture, the way she held herself even in complete degradation. His voice came out strangled, disbelieving. "Mom?" Rose's body went rigid. Her trembling intensified. She didn't turn to face him. Margaret, sensing something shifting in the room's dynamic, saw her moment. "See, I told you she's been planning something. She probably stole that from your things. Going through your personal..." "Shut up." Alex's voice cracked like a whip, loud enough that Margaret actually stepped backward, her white outfit pressing against the bathroom wall. He didn't take his eyes off Rose. "Please, please look at me." The old woman's head moved slowly, painfully, like the motion cost her everything. Water still dripped from her chin. Her eyes were red from chemical splash and tears, from physical pain and emotional devastation. But when they met Alex's, there was no hiding what lived there. Recognition, grief, fear, love that had survived decades of separation and silence. Alex's phone slipped from his other hand, clattering against the marble. "Mama?" The word came out broken, disbelieving, a question and an accusation and a prayer all at once. Rose's face crumbled. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged except a sob that had been building for years, maybe decades. Her arthritic hands came up to cover her face as her shoulders shook with the violence of suppressed emotion finally breaking free. The bathroom door was still open. Margaret stood frozen, her brain visibly trying to calculate what this meant, how this changed her position, whether this made things better or catastrophically worse. She opened her mouth to say something. Another lie, another deflection, another attempt to control the narrative. Alex's hand shot out in that stop gesture, and this time his voice carried absolute authority. "If you speak right now, if you say one single word, I will personally make sure you spend Christmas in jail. Do you understand me?" Margaret's mouth snapped shut. Her face had gone pale beneath her makeup. Her expensive skincare suddenly unable to mask the fear that was finally, belatedly arriving. Alex turned back to Rose, to his mother, the locket still clutched in his fist, his other hand reaching toward her tentatively, then pulling back. Uncertain if he had the right to touch her, after she'd been forced to remain invisible in his home for 3 weeks. How long have you been? The words wouldn't form properly. His brain couldn't process the enormity of what he was understanding. Why didn't you? His mother hadn't abandoned him. His mother was here. His mother had been cleaning his toilets while his wife had just forced his mother's face into a toilet bowl on Christmas Day. The rage that flooded through him was so pure, so white-hot, that for a moment he couldn't breathe. His vision actually narrowed, tunnel focusing on Margaret standing by the bathroom door in her white outfit, looking like guilt wearing expensive fabric. She tried to speak again, her voice small. "Alex, I didn't know. You put your hands on my mother." His voice was eerily quiet now, each word precisely enunciated. "You grabbed her by the hair. You shoved her face toward toilet water. You called her a hag. You told her to drink it." Margaret's face cycled through expressions too quickly to track: fear, calculation, desperation. "I didn't. How was I supposed to? She never said." She shouldn't have had to say. Alex's control finally cracked, his voice rising to something close to a shout. "You assaulted a 75-year-old woman in our home. The fact that she's my mother makes it unspeakable. But Margaret, it was already unforgivable." The sound of vehicles pulling into the driveway filtered through the frosted bathroom window, car doors slamming, voices calling to each other. Police had arrived faster than expected, probably because the address was in Beverly Hills, because Alex's name carried weight even with law enforcement, because money and influence could summon help instantly when it chose to. Margaret pressed herself harder against the wall, her face a mask of calculation giving way to genuine terror. "Alex, please, we can work this out. I'll apologize. I'll do therapy. I'll do whatever you want. Please don't let them arrest me. Not on Christmas. Think about what this will do to your company, to your reputation." "My reputation?" Alex's laugh was harsh and bitter. He pulled his phone from the floor and opened the security app again with shaking fingers. "You're worried about my reputation?" He navigated to settings, found the bathroom camera feed, and tapped the save button. The last 90 seconds of footage downloaded to his phone's encrypted storage. Evidence preserved. Truth captured. No possibility of deletion or denial. Margaret watched with dawning horror as he then did something she didn't expect. His fingers moved across the screen and throughout the house, electronic locks engaged with soft clicks. The bathroom door swung shut automatically and locked with a decisive thunk. Margaret was locked in with them, unable to flee to her bedroom to call lawyers, or destroy evidence, or begin whatever damage control her mind was frantically calculating. The panic that flooded her face was almost satisfying. Alex's voice was calm again. That terrible calm that comes after shock has burned away everything except clarity. "The police are already here. You're going to stay in this bathroom until they come in. And you're going to be silent. You don't get to speak anymore. You don't get to explain. You had your chance to be a decent human being, and you chose violence instead." He knelt back down beside Rose, beside his mother, the woman he'd believed had abandoned him, but who had instead been surviving in ways he was only beginning to understand. He didn't touch her. Not yet. Not until she indicated she was ready. But he positioned himself between her and Margaret like a barrier, like protection that should have been there all along. "You are my wife," he said, without looking at Margaret, his voice carrying the weight of past tense. "And she—" He gestured gently toward Rose. "She's my mother. And right now, in this moment, covered in toilet water because of what you did, she has more dignity in her smallest finger than you've had in your entire body since the day we met." The sound of the front door opening echoed through the house. Police entering, probably with the security guard's master code. Heavy footsteps on marble floors. Professional voices calling out, establishing presence, ensuring safety. Alex stood and moved to the bathroom door, unlocking it remotely from his phone. It swung open to reveal 2 LAPD officers in uniform, hands near their weapons, eyes scanning the scene with professional efficiency. An elderly black woman collapsed against a toilet, face wet, uniform soaked. A younger white woman in expensive clothes pressed against the far wall, mascara beginning to streak. And Alex Chen, local tech billionaire, standing between them with his phone in hand and an expression the officers had seen before. The look of someone whose entire world had just been revealed as constructed from lies. "Sir," the lead officer said carefully, a black woman with sergeant stripes and kind eyes that had seen too much human cruelty. "We received a call about an assault. Can you tell us what happened here?" Alex's hand moved to his pocket, to the locket he'd placed there for safekeeping. The metal pressed into his palm, grounding him. "My wife assaulted our employee, an elderly woman." She forced her face toward the toilet. "There's video evidence on the security system." The sergeant's expression hardened slightly. She moved past Alex into the bathroom, her gaze taking in Rose's condition, the wet hair, the trembling hands, the chemical smell, the undeniable evidence of violence. "Ma'am, are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" Rose's voice emerged raw and broken. I need to sit somewhere that isn't." The words dissolved into coughing. "Of course." The sergeant gestured to her partner, a younger Latino officer. "Help her to the living room, carefully, and call for paramedics." As the officer moved to assist Rose, Alex finally found his voice again, directed at his mother, his face doing something complicated that might have been asking permission. May I help you?" Rose met his eyes, her son's eyes. Hers were red-rimmed, exhausted, filled with more emotion than any single expression could contain. After a long moment, she nodded once, a small movement that carried decades of longing. Alex moved to her other side, coordinating with the officer to help her stand. Her weight was almost nothing, like helping a bird made of hollow bones and survival instinct. She leaned on him slightly as they moved out of the bathroom, and even through his shock, he noticed how she smelled. Cheap soap and cleaning chemicals, and something underneath that memory, recognized even if his conscious mind didn't yet fully accept it. The scent of the person who'd held him when he was small, before the world had torn them apart. They guided her to the living room where the 12-foot Christmas tree stood in absurd festive glory, lights twinkling merrily over a scene that had nothing to do with joy. Alex helped her onto the white leather sofa, grabbed decorative pillows to support her back, and knelt beside her again, unable to bear the symbolism of standing over her after what Margaret had done. Behind them in the bathroom, Margaret's voice rose in desperate protest. "This is insane. I'm being treated like a criminal in my own home. You can't just—" The sound of handcuffs clicking into place silenced her mid-sentence. The sergeant emerged from the bathroom with Margaret in custody, the younger woman's wrists secured behind her back, the white outfit that had made her feel powerful now making her look like guilt wrapped in designer fabric. Margaret's face had gone pale beneath her makeup, her blue eyes wide and disbelieving, still not quite accepting that consequences had arrived this quickly, this definitively. "You're arresting me?" Margaret's voice pitched high with shock. "For what? For disciplining my own staff?" "For assault," the sergeant said flatly. "We have witness testimony and your husband mentioned video evidence. And based on the victim's age and condition, we're likely looking at elder abuse, which carries enhanced penalties under California law." Margaret's eyes swung to Alex, searching for the man who'd always protected her, always smoothed things over, always chosen peace over confrontation. "Baby, please, tell them this is a misunderstanding. Tell them." Alex didn't look at her. His entire attention was focused on Rose, on the way her hands trembled in her lap, on the water still dripping from her silver locks onto his expensive sofa, on the decades of questions that suddenly had answers he'd never imagined needing. "Sir," the sergeant's voice was gentle, "I'll need your statement, and we'll need access to that security footage." Alex nodded without turning. His hand moved unconsciously to his pocket where the locket rested, that small piece of metal and faded photograph that had detonated his understanding of his entire life. The questions were building in his throat, threatening to choke him. "Where have you been? Why didn't you come back? What happened? Who told you to stay away? Why were you cleaning my house instead of telling me who you were?" but none of them felt appropriate to ask in a living room full of police officers while Margaret was being read her rights in the background, while his mother's dignity was slowly, painfully reassembling itself piece by piece. Rose reached out slowly, her arthritic hand shaking, and touched his arm. The gesture was tentative, asking permission, testing whether he would pull away now that he knew, now that the secret was exposed. Alex covered her hand with his own, and something in his chest that had been clenched tight for 3 decades, maybe his entire life, finally loosened. "I thought you were dead," he whispered, and his voice cracked on the last word. "Uncle Richard's family told me. They said you'd abandoned us. But after a few years, I just assumed. I thought you were gone." Rose's face crumbled again. Tears cut clean tracks through the residue of toilet water on her cheeks. "I never abandoned you." Her voice was fierce despite its roughness, carrying a strength that arthritis and age and Margaret's cruelty hadn't been able to destroy. "Never. Not for one single day. I was—" Her breath hitched. "They made me leave. Made me hide. And by the time it was safe to look for you, you'd been told I was the villain. And I didn't know. I couldn't know if I'd believe you," Alex finished. "If I'd want to see you." She nodded, unable to speak. "So you became a cleaner in my house." His voice carried wonder and horror in equal measure. "You were watching me, making sure I was— what? Safe? Happy? Worthy," she whispered. "Making sure the man you'd become was worthy of the truth. Making sure your home was—" Her eyes flicked briefly toward where Margaret stood in handcuffs, then back to Alex. "Making sure it was safe to come back into your life." "And it wasn't safe," Alex said bitterly, "because the woman I married just assaulted you in my bathroom on Christmas Day." The paramedics arrived then, 2 efficient professionals with emergency bags, their practiced cheerfulness jarring against the emotional weight saturating the living room. They moved to check Rose's vitals, shining lights in her eyes, asking questions about pain levels and breathing difficulties, treating her with the careful respect her age demanded. One of them, a young woman with kind eyes, noticed the chemical smell and the wet hair. "Ma'am, did someone force your head into cleaning solution?" Rose's silence was answer enough. The paramedic's face hardened. She turned to the sergeant. "We need to document this. Chemical exposure, possible aspiration, evidence of physical assault. This needs to be photographed and included in your report." The sergeant nodded grimly and pulled out a camera. Through it all, Alex sat beside his mother, his hand still covering hers, his mind trying to process 3 decades of separation compressed into this single, devastating Christmas day. The mansion around them, the 12-foot tree, the expensive decorations, the catered food waiting in the kitchen for a party that would never happen, suddenly felt like a mausoleum, a temple to wealth built on foundations of lies and violence. Outside, through the massive windows Margaret had insisted on installing, neighbors were beginning to gather. Word spread quickly in Beverly Hills. Police cars, an ambulance, something scandalous happening at the Chen mansion on Christmas Day. Phones were out, recording, capturing footage that would be on TMZ within hours. The tech billionaire's wife arrested on Christmas. Elder abuse, assault. The narrative already writing itself across social media platforms while the truth still struggled to breathe in the living room where it had nearly been drowned. Margaret was led out in handcuffs, her white outfit somehow still spotless despite the violence she'd committed, her face a mask of shock giving way to calculation. At the door, she turned back one final time. "Alex, I'm sorry. I didn't know she was— We can fix this. Please don't let them take me. Not on Christmas. Please. Think about what this will do to us. To your company. To everything we've built." "We didn't build anything," Alex said quietly, his voice carrying across the living room with devastating clarity. "I built a company. You performed a life on Instagram. And the only thing we built together was a lie that just died in a bathroom where you tried to drown my mother." Margaret's face went through one final transformation, from pleading to rage to something that might have been understanding that she'd lost, that it was over. that justice had arrived too fast for manipulation to stop it. The door closed behind her with a soft, expensive click. And in the living room, under twinkling Christmas lights that had been meant to showcase Margaret's perfect holiday, Alex remained at his mother's side and finally, began asking the questions that would piece together the decades of separation, betrayal, and survival that had led to this impossible reunion, born from violence and a locket that had refused to let truth stay buried. But that story, the full story of what had happened 30 years ago, of how his uncle had orchestrated everything, of what his mother had protected all these years, that story would have to wait. Because first, there were paramedics to cooperate with, police statements to give, evidence to preserve, and a mother and son who needed to simply exist in the same space, breathing the same air, after 3 decades of forced separation. The revenge wasn't instant, but it was absolute, and it was only just beginning.